As my last year in full-time education winds down, I've been preparing for the next step of what I hope will be a very fruitful career. My big focus right now is on screenwriting more than practical filmmaking, mainly because, well, nobody really hires directors without a name, but they'll always give some type of shot to a first-time writer. So, lately, in the past couple of months, I've been shopping around a couple of scripts, trying out a couple of different genres, sent off to a few festivals, got some decent feedback, nothing big yet, but hey, we'll see soon enough. That quick bit of backstory hopefully gives you some context for what I'm about to say about The Words, since its story very much has a similar kind of path to that. The dual directors and writers, one of whom was a bit part actor as I recall, had been developing this script since about the 90s, as I recall, from the Making a Featurette. And they had shopped it around to a bunch of different contests and festivals, seeing if it would get any notice. And then in 2000, they got lucky at Sundance, and that's when the momentum for this movie began, and they were able to fully iron it out as they saw fit thanks to the workshops there. 12 years later, it gets released to decidedly less than stellar feedback, but not without a vocal minority that very much supported the film. And I think that you can really tell with this kind of script that it is both the best and worst of what comes out of a lot of these contests and film festivals. The positives come in form of the concept or the premise of the film, which a lot of these festivals and contests do place a lot of emphasis on, because of course they're trying to help you get the script sold, and they really want something that is both commercial but also distinct and pungent and has possibilities. And The Words pretty much has this in spades. A movie about writers, the writing process, and indeed how stories influence all our lives. A very universal theme for film, and something that has great potential to be a great discussion on the creative processes. Frankly, is it any wonder that the guys at Sundance really warmed up to this? Frankly, I think a lot of the negativity that came towards this film was because people were expecting more of a revenge story, in a sense. They thought, oh, a movie about Bradley Cooper stealing from Jeremy Irons, and then Jeremy Irons comes back to him. They think, oh, it's going to be a revenge story, and Jeremy Irons is going to mess up Bradley's life. But really, it's not that kind of story at all. I remember hearing complaints about people saying, oh, flashbacks are pointless, and Jeremy Irons' character doesn't really do anything. And it's like, the film very much clearly states that it's not trying to be a revenge story. This isn't Irons getting back at Cooper. This is very much a story about, well, stories, and about the wells that we draw on, and how life in many ways parallels the things we create. And how it too can, like stories, have its own share of implausibilities, grand moments, and incredible lows. Frankly, anybody who's watching this who's a writer in any medium can really relate to Bradley Cooper's struggle here. He's a decent guy, and he works hard on his material, but he just doesn't have that spark, or he just can't find that work that he absolutely just clicks with. That big magical idea that's going to set him on his path as a writer, and he just doesn't get that. And a lot of writers do experience that frustration, where you have this story that you're just meant to tell, that you just have an absolute want and passion for, and you just can't get out. And I think a lot of people who are aspiring writers, be they for screen or radio or TV or even novels, can really relate to what Cooper's going through in this film, in the first half anyway. And of course, what's a huge part of being a writer? Choice, decisions, and I like that the film very much places a big emphasis on that, on the choices that both the Cooper and Irons character make. The fact that Cooper tries to be a good husband and a good writer, but because he's struggling, he ultimately opts to nick this little manuscript that he finds in an old bag that his significant other, here played by Zoe Saldana, buys him one day, which turns out to be Jeremy Irons' old bag from France. And then, of course, Jeremy Irons coming along and influencing Cooper to make his decision about what he should do next, whether he should tell the world the truth or leave it as is, and in turn allowing the Irons character to make a choice as to what he's going to do about the situation. and how strangely he's contented by the whole thing. Of course, he's a little upset because it's like, you stole my life, but it's not that he's mad. That's kind of a refreshing thing when it comes to a lot of these stories that deal with plagiarism. Usually the older guy is really demented and angry and ruthless. Here, Irons' character is kind of benign. He's a little prickly, but he's not this mean-spirited spirit of vengeance. He's an old man who's lived a very long and interesting life, and he doesn't want to see his memories being paraded around without care by somebody who never lived them. Which again is another aspect that writers can really relate to. When you have something that's very personal to you, a story that you deeply care for, and then you see it somewhere else, or you see someone trying to pull it off similarly, and you just feel kind of offended. You feel like, I'm trying to do this story and you're doing it, and you just don't get what makes these kind of things tick. You're kind of insulting the memory or the point of what this story is or who the people are in it, if it's based on fact or fiction, regardless. And oftentimes we as writers can get very defensive and protective about these things, and when we see someone trying to do something like that, we get rather aggressive about it. That's just part of being in the creative mindset, is that you get all fiery. That's unfortunately part and parcel of the whole gig, especially when it comes to very personal stories like it turns out to be with the Irons character. And even moving back to just the film on its own in terms of its construction, the flashback structure when it relates to these two actually works pretty well. It always has a point, and Irons' voice does go a long way to helping out with the flashbacks. Though thankfully he doesn't excessively narrate, and the sequences are allowed to breathe on their own, and you really start to get kind of wrapped up in his story and what happened between him and his wife and the unfortunate fate of his child. And it's surprisingly well done, and it's not overplayed or excessively melodramatic. It feels very sincere, and doesn't feel like it's just cheaply trying to pluck at your heartstrings for a quick cry. There is very much a big somberness riding over the entire flashback of Irons' story, and honestly, I don't feel like it sagged or dragged or was completely needless. I feel that it very much was a big part of the point that the film was making, and I really don't personally understand the criticisms against it. But speaking of criticisms, there is another side to this coin, which is the lesser half of what can come out of festivals and contests. And that is redundancies, or filler, or just overworking, whatever you want to call it. These two, at its core of the film they made, have a really solid piece here. Nothing that is necessarily absolutely groundbreaking, but still really solid, and again, has a great relatability to people who are in their position. But the problem is, it adds all this extra stuff on top that just doesn't contribute anyway, and feels more like it's just there to repeat what the sequences with Irons and Cooper already state very clearly. There's a whole overriding story around them that concerns Dennis Quaid, who's writing a book that tells the story of these two guys. So already you kind of wonder, well, where could this go? But the thing is, it never really goes anywhere. It honestly serves only to reiterate what the Cooper and Irons segments already tell us. Aside from the fact that the segments here, which have Dennis Quaid and Olivia Wilde, don't really feel like they go anywhere or add anything new. They're very sparse throughout the film, so pretty much if you cut them out, you don't feel like you're losing much of anything. And they just serve to reiterate the whole message about the creative process and life and stories, and it feels terribly redundant, and it does kind of weigh the pacing down. And it really comes off more like it was just an extra element, just to add an extra layer there, just to make the script seem maybe smarter or beef up the runtime. It really doesn't serve any narrative or thematic purpose other than regurgitation, and that's a real irritant. Because so far when it comes to the Cooper and Irons segments, these guys hold their own. But then this just screams lack of confidence or overworking or excessive meddling. As if the people they workshopped it with just didn't feel that the Cooper and Irons segments alone were enough, that they needed this extra element for general audiences to get into. Cut these sequences out and you would really lose nothing of consequence to the movie itself. This just feels like filler, or rather, to be more apt, padding. And it is the most blatant screaming of first time that you could have in any film. Because honestly, once you're into the Cooper and I and stuff, then when Quaid comes in, it just kind of brings the whole narrative momentum to a screeching halt, and you're just basically waiting for the next segment. It isn't like some other films I've talked about before, where it feels like the overarching narrative has a purpose, like say in Princess Bride. Here, it just feels like it's there so they can squeeze some more big-name actors into it. It is literally pointless. And frankly, it's easy to see why some felt the film was too slow burn or too slow paced for their taste, because you got this completely pointless thing sagging the movie down. And I feel that's a real shame, because these two, I think, really hit upon a great idea and did execute it well enough for the most part, but then their inexperience showed at points and it kind of weighs the whole thing down. The film is certainly worth checking out, and now it's probably dirt cheap on most streaming sites or even in your local bargain bins. So if you're somebody who's in the creative mindset right now, if you're an aspiring writer of any kind, give the movie a whirl. I think you might get a big kick out of it.